All right. To wrap up our basic information about cells, we're just going to do kind of an overview. It's going to take probably a couple of podcasts, maybe three. We'll try to make them brief to kind of just give you a reminding overview about the different cell types, different kinds of organelles, what they do. We'll go more in depth in some of these organelles later on. So, at any rate, this podcast is just basic introductory information to remind you of and reminders about basic cell types. Okay? Um, so, to start with, cell theory. Don't forget what cell theory is. You've had this since you were certainly in ninth grade, if not before. Um, Cells are the basic units of life. Yes, you can have things that are smaller than cells, but they're not alive. Okay, molecules are smaller than cells. They're not alive. Cells are made up of thousands and thousands of molecules. Okay, all living things are made of cells. We know nothing alive that is not made of cells on our planet, at any rate. Cells come only from other cells. There's many questions that arise. Where did the first cell come from? Which we talked about in Origins of Life. But today on planet Earth, we get no cells unless they are coming from other cells. There's no spontaneous generation on planet Earth today. All right, cell types. There are two major types of cells: prokaryotic. Let me make sure my pen is on. Prokaryotic cells. When you see prokaryotic, you need to think bacteria. They are synonymous. The most simple, most ancient cell type. Okay, the very first cells were probably prokaryotic cells. They lack organelles. We'll talk more about that in a minute. Eukaryotic cells are the other fundamental cell type. So there's two fundamental types of cells: prokaryotes and eukaryotes. Eukaryotes have organelles. Prokaryotes do not. They are much more complex. Eukaryotes are much more sophisticated. There are a few types of eukaryotic cells. Mostly we think of animal cells and plant cells. But of course, fungus are also eukaryotic organisms. So you could throw fungal cells in there too, though we usually don't. We'll leave it at that. So what we're going to examine are the fundamental differences in prokaryotes and eukaryotes. You need to understand this. So you have a little chart on your handout. We're going to investigate these characteristics. Presence of organelles, the type of cell walls, how the DNA is arranged, the types of ribosomes, and how they compare in size. Okay, so first of all, with regard to organelles, prokaryotes don't have any. Eukaryotes have a lot. Okay, fundamental. What are organelles? Please make sure you understand what they are. Of course, they are cell parts. That's what we can think of right away. But they're important in that they are hollow compartments made out of plasma membrane, cell membrane stuff. So they are hollow sacs, and that's significant because they are compartments. They are places where cellular activities can occur in isolation and be separated from other cellular activities that might not be compatible. If we want to simultaneously be creating molecules in our bodies, macromolecules, and also breaking them down in the same cell, you can't, those are two incompatible activities. They would conflict. But if you separate them in little compartments, then you can do building over here and you can do breaking down over here. And those things can happen simultaneously. So that's the advantage of organelles. You can separate oppositional cellular activities from each other. Now, cell walls. Prokaryotes all have cell walls, and they are made out of a substance called peptidoglycan. Peptide means protein, glycan means carbohydrate. So it's a protein-carb combination. This is really important in that in the way that certain antibiotics are used, because eukaryotes may or may not have cell walls. For example, animal cells don't have any cell walls. Plant cells do have cell walls, but they are made of cellulose. Okay, so because bacterial cell walls are made of something entirely different from plants, or we simply have no cell walls, antibiotics can target this stuff and poison bacterial cells, destroy their cell walls, but leave our cells unharmed because we don't have cell walls. So that's one way that antibiotics can work. That's cellulose you're looking at right there, though. Fungal cell walls have cell walls made of chitin, which we've already talked about briefly. It's a carbohydrate. So unique composition in prokaryotes. And that's important also when we're trying to figure out what cells are related to, who's related to whom. If we see peptidoglycan, we know that's going to be a prokaryotic relative. All right, that's chitin right there. All right, DNA. In prokaryotes, the DNA, they have no nucleus because they have no organelles. So the DNA is not protected in a nucleus. It is just floating around in the cytoplasm. Okay? The shape of their DNA molecule is a ring, like right here. It's a ring-shaped chromosome. It's still a double helix. So if you took that ring and looked at it real closely, you would see it's got that double helix makeup. But it's just floating about in the cytoplasm in a region called the nucleoid region, but it's not protected in a nucleus. It's completely naked out there in the cytoplasm. Eukaryotic DNA is very different. Of course, it is protected in a nucleus, but it's also a different shapes. Eukaryotes have a much longer DNA molecules, much more DNA. The DNA is coiled around little spools called histone proteins. It's coiled around these little spools to help it stay organized and prevent it from getting tangled and bunched up. Bacteria don't have that. Their DNA is not as long and complex, so they don't really need it. And also, our chromosomes are linear. They are these little straight lines, if you will. They are not circular in their shape. Okay, so there's some fundamental differences there. Ribosomes. Basically, these are the only organelles that prokaryotes and eukaryotes have in common. But these are not really, if you look at this third bullet, they're really not organelles because they're not hollow, they're not a compartment, they're not made of membrane. They are little blobs of protein and RNA. They are blobs of protein and RNA. They are where proteins get made. So it's kind of ironic that protein blobs are making more protein blobs, but there you go. They are primitive structures, and what I mean by that is they are very ancient. Prokaryotes have them, eukaryotes have them. So whereas some organelles arose new in eukaryotes, ribosomes have been around a long time. The very first prokaryotes had ribosomes. So they're ancient primitive structures. So ribosomes are interesting to look at to determine evolutionary relationships of some of the most ancient organisms. Prokaryotic ribosomes generally float free in the cytoplasm, whereas eukaryotic chromosomes, some of them float free in the cytoplasm, and when they do that, their proteins that they make, the protein creations they make, stay in the cell and they are used by the cell. Some of their ribosomes, though, in a eukaryote are bound to membranes. In other words, they're sitting on a membrane, usually of endoplasmic reticulum. And in that case, these proteins made by these ribosomes will be exported to outside of the cell. Okay. Um, there are some subtle differences between ribosomes and prokaryotes versus eukaryotes. In prokaryotes, the ribosomes are a bit smaller, and there are different proportions of RNA and protein in prokaryotes from eukaryotes. That's important because, again, of what I said about how we can use, if we can look at how these ribosomes are built, we can use those clues to give us clues about who's related to whom. If you have a certain type of ribosome, you're probably more closely related to a prokaryote ancestor, and so on. So those can give us important clues. But so ribosomes are shared by both with some subtle differences. Okay. Size-wise, prokaryotes are much smaller. This purplish color, that is a eukaryotic, typical eukaryotic animal cell. This is how big a bacterial cell would be in relation to that. So very much smaller in size. Also, please keep in mind, I don't have a slide for this, but please keep in mind, ancient and much more simple or primitive. These are more recent, though that's a relative term, and much more complex. Okay. All right, plant cells versus animal cells. So now we're just going to look at eukaryotic cells and just look at some of the basic fundamental differences between the two most commonly discussed, and that's plant and animal. Okay, so animal cells, no cell walls. Plant cells, cell walls made out of cellulose. Vacuoles, little compartments that typically store things. Plant cells have a big central vacuole that is usually, though not exclusively, for storing large amounts of water and keeping the cell kind of inflated. Vacuoles in animal cells are small, much smaller and really kind of transient. They're not permanent. They may contain food for a brief time until the food is consumed and then the vacuole is gone. Okay. Obviously, plant cells have chloroplasts. Animal cells do not. Generally speaking, plant cells lack lysosomes. These are digestive organelles that break down macromolecules. Animal cells do have lysosomes. Plant cells generally lack centrioles. Generally, not always. These are structures that organize microtubule assemblies, kind of cytoskeleton assemblies, that help split the chromosomes during cell division. Animal cells have them, and animal cells have centrioles. Generally, plant cells don't. Please note, they both have mitochondria, both of them. Sometimes we forget that plant cells, even though they make their own food here, they still have to break that food down once they make it in a mitochondria to get the energy out. So the mighty mitochondria gives both cells usable energy. Okay? Don't forget our talk about why cells are small. Small objects have a much larger surface area to volume ratio, and we talked about how important that is in being able to diffuse large quantities of stuff into the entire volume of the cell. We talked about that in class. If you need to pause this and examine the slide more closely, you can. So please remember that the levels of organization. Cell is the fundamental life unit. Many cells doing the same job, working together to do the same job, are called tissues. Like, for example, muscle tissue would be made out of many muscle cells. Organs are made out of two or more tissues. Like your heart might have nervous tissue and muscle tissue in it. And of course, then this really is a jump too far ahead. Don't forget organ systems. Many organs working together to do a common job, and then organisms, which would be a whole individual. Okay. Okay. We're going to talk as we go through the different organelles about how they help cells do all these things: gas exchange, making energy, building molecules, getting rid of waste, all of this kind of stuff. The organelles help cells do this. So we'll talk about that in the next podcast. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you next time.